Welcome two speakers today. Doctors Frederick Payton and Michael Cox will discuss the challenges and promise of sustainable rice certification schemes in the Dominican Republic. They're both affiliated with the NGO AgroFrontera. They're in DR. Let me share a bit about each of our speakers. Frederick is the Executive Director of AgroFrontera, and I believe the founder, or one of the founders at least. He leads programs that enhance biodiversity conservation and improve economic performance and social responsibility of local, national, and international food systems. Frontera has a particular focus on improving livelihoods of small-scale farmers and artisanal fishers. Dr. Payton has worked previously at the Institute of Community and Area Development and the Office of International Agriculture at the University of Georgia. He was a senior scientist and interim director of SIP, the International Potato Center's Central American and Caribbean Regional Office. He served on a number of boards, served on the board of directors of the Organic Farming Research Foundation, Henry A. Wallace Institute for Alternative Agriculture, and Georgia Organics. And we should welcome him home. He did a Ph.D. In horticulture right here at Cornell University. Hey, go ahead. And our second speaker is Michael Cox. Well, I don't know whether you're first or second, but our co-presenter, I should say, is Michael Cox. Michael's an environmental social scientist. He studies environmental policy and governance with a focus on community-based natural resource management. He's also a socio-ecological systems research consultant with AgroFrontera. He also wasn't in the bio, but I looked you up, and he's also an associate professor in Dartmouth's environmental studies program. He's conducted empirical fieldwork-based analysis of irrigation systems in the Southwest US, Peru, and Kenya. His current empirical work is focused on community-based fisheries and rice farming systems in the DR, where he collaborates with AgroFrontera. He's the co-founder and co-host of the In Commons podcast, which is the official podcast of the International Association for the Study of the Commons. He's worked with Eleanor Ostrom in the past, as well at during his PhD at Indiana University, and he's finishing a book project on environmental property rights to be published this year. So thank you both for being here.
All right, hi everyone. I got to speak real close to this thing, right?
Yeah.
I was told that I kind of have to. Okay. So thanks for having us. I was excited to come here and speak with Freddie about work that I think we both care about. One point I wanted to make about our relationship and why I think it's so helpful is really I started working in the Dominican Republic without knowing Freddie for a few years, and I got to know him. And I really realized that both we shared values about, wanting to really change things in this area. And for me, I had kind of bopped around, done what I would call kind of parachute research in different places. I would go to Peru, I would go to Kenya, and respondents would ask me, how is this research going to help me? And I really struggled when they would ask me that because I wouldn't necessarily have a good answer. I would say, in my mind, I would say, well, I'm collecting data and this is going to help me. I know this is going to produce some science and maybe this is indirectly going to help you. But as a young scientist, I really struggle with my position in these different places that I was going. And so I started working in the Dominican Republic, initially on the fisheries sector before I really got to know Freddie. And Freddie's really the reason why I've stayed working in the Dominican Republic, because of our relationship and because it's felt like it's more of a give and take. When I think about going to the Dominican Republic, it isn't just to collect more research for my next paper. It's because I also I look forward to being in Freddie's truck and talking to him about what he's thinking about with his NGO and the different things he wants to try. And I try to talk him down from the latest market-based policy that he's thinking about because I'm a little worried about some of the nuts and bolts. I found that to be really fulfilling. as basically another set of values that I was helping to contribute to, in addition to just kind of, I don't want to say just, but in addition to producing knowledge. And so for me, my experience in the Dominican Republic has definitely involved an evolution of my own identity that I have found really helpful and rewarding. So I appreciate Freddie for bringing me along to Cornell today, but also for helping me evolve that identity. So, oh. There we go. So there's two main questions that we're going to be talking to you about today. And I kind of chuckled to myself from Freddie and I were preparing this slide. I'm still mostly a scientist at heart, a social scientist. And so when I first wrote this slide, I wanted to write research questions. But they're not just research questions. They're also applied questions that Freddie is trying to answer to make a difference in this system. And so this is really kind of the outline of our talk. The first one is, what are the barriers to and opportunities for pro-environmental change in the Dominican rice sector? I'm mostly going to be talking about that. It's kind of how we decided to divide up the labor for the talk. That will serve as the background for what is in a way a more specific question of how can certification of rice specifically move the system, the agricultural system where we work, more towards sustainability. To give you a little more background, the words that are doing a lot of work in each of these questions for me is pro-environmental and sustainable. And when Freddie and I think about pro-environmental, a lot of what we're thinking about is input intensity. So the systems where we work are quite input intensive. When I first went to the Dominican Republic, I was surprised to see, this is kind of what it looks like. It's a monoculture. Honestly, I don't know if this is like the right thing to say, but it's like the most beautiful monoculture I've ever seen. It's like glowing fields of rice. And even though I'm supposed to not like monocultures for a variety of reasons. So when we think about pro-environmental change in the Dominican rice sector, we're thinking about reducing input intensity, helping the farmers use less water, use less fertilizers and fewer pesticides is really what's kind of top of mind for us. When we think about sustainability, we're thinking about some of the same issues. We're also thinking about it as something that's kind of more multidimensional and also potentially including some social changes that would be helpful in the system. And when Freddie talks about the actual certification process, we'll get a little bit into that. So Freddie's going to talk to you a little bit about where we actually are in the world to provide some geographic context for the rest of the talk.
Right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. We're thrilled to be here. So this is the Dominican Republic. We're working up in the northwest corner, right along the Haitian border, in our project. That's where AgroFrontera is headquartered. We're not a regional NGO. We're kind of a really local NGO that works with farmers, fishers, and other stakeholders. So a little focus, a little more context of the work that we're doing. This blue area represents the kind of the pilot project area, which is around 5,000 hectares of rice. It's a continuous rice monocrop, as Michael alluded to. And there's, in the whole area itself, there's over 16,000 hectares of rice. So it's a very important crop in the Dominican Republic. 30% of the production of rice comes from this area. And it also has socioeconomic challenges, high rates of poverty, and also it's blessed being in the northwest corner of the DR. It has lots of marine protected areas. So most of this rice that you see here flows into this protected area marked in red, which is the mangroves of Estero Balsa National Park. And that park is precious. It has majestic mangroves. People could say perhaps because of the nitrogen coming out of the rice, but it's a conservation priority for the government. And also you see we're right along the Haitian border marked in yellow. So there's a lot of social dynamics going on.
So to unpack the first question, which is about the barriers to change and the opportunities for change in the rice sector. So I want to provide some background on work that Freddie and I have done together to answer that question, to set the stage for thinking about certification as a way forward. Freddie and I published a paper in 2019, along with a couple other colleagues, where we interpreted the Dominican rice sector as what we called a gilded trap. So the idea of a trap, there's actually a fairly large social science literature on the idea of traps. And most fundamentally, what a trap is it's a social situation that's kind of self-reinforcing or path-dependent. So once you're in a trap, it's hard to get out. Probably the most common type of trap that's talked about in development context is a poverty trap. So if you can escape from poverty, it's easier to stay out of it. But if you're in it, it's harder to get out of it. So this is a very different kind of trap, right? It's gilded. And so what does that mean, right? Well, our inspiration for this idea actually comes from a fairly different context. Although something else that's really interested me in my collaboration with Freddie has been the opportunity to study both the farming systems and the fisheries along the coast at the same time. I feel like we often, and for me, the lesson there is about, it's really about interdisciplinarity. We often feel like we want to specialize as, oh, I study rice and that's my thing, or I'm a fisheries person. In my field, there's like a whole fisheries group and it's like, that's what they do. And they don't want to, move too far beyond that. But a lot of what's motivated me is thinking about how do these systems relate to each other? What is similar and what's different between them? And what can we learn from one to the other? So the inspiration for thinking about the rice sector as a gilded trap and seeing that as a barrier to change in the system actually comes from a fisheries case, which is in the Gulf of Maine, which is not too far from here, by Robert Stenick et al. in 2010. So they were studying, and I'll try to make this short, even though it's kind of its own cool story. The lobster fishery in Maine is very famous. It's famous for being extremely productive amidst lots of faltering stocks around the world and in the US. The lobster fishery is still doing very well. They're still catching a lot, and it's seen in my own field of community-based natural resource management as like a paradigm for effective governance. Robert Stenick and all came along and said, that's not the whole story. This is actually a highly productive but highly fragile system. So the Gulf of Maine is the diversity of the Gulf of Maine has been highly reduced ecologically, and the diversity economically is also highly reduced. There's lots of fishers who only depend on lobster for their catch. It's also surprisingly input intensive. So they catch lobster actually by putting herring in traps. So it depends on the importation of nutrients, kind of the way that aquaculture or agriculture do. So the idea here is that a gilded trap is a situation where you're really emphasizing productivity, but you're emphasizing it at the expense of ecological and economic diversity, which can lead to vulnerabilities and fragility. Generally, I see this as a potential critique of a lot of industrial agriculture and the way in which some aquaculture operations are moving as well. So in this paper, we apply this lens to the Dominican rice system to help us think about the barriers to change in the system. Part of those barriers relate to the farmer's position. And again, even though this was kind of one case, I think this is highly generalizable. So in this paper, we collaborated to have structured interviews with about 200 farmers. We did some key informant interviews with a range of other actors, including owners of a local rice company that Freddie works with and some governmental actors as well, to try to understand how well this lens applies to this case we were in. And you can think about that square that Freddie drew on that map as kind of the focal area where we were studying. And one of the main things we found when doing these structured interviews with farmers is that they're highly leveraged, right? The amount of debt they have, the ratio of their debt to resources that they have is quite high, right? Which makes them kind of vulnerable, reduces their margins, reduces their agency as agency in the system. They also really struggle with really high interest rates. This is an industrialized and input intensive system. They have to borrow money to use those inputs, to use the machinery that they need to grow the rice. And they suffer from really high interest rates, mostly from agrochemical companies, which is kind of the next component. So farmers in the system have little agency for systemic change, particularly relative to market intermediaries. And this is a relationship that really struck us when we were doing this research several years ago. The main intermediary that we found were local agrochemical companies. And I kind of want to make another connection to the fishing sector here as well, because this idea of potentially problematic market intermediaries is also something that we really see strongly in a lot of small-scale fishing systems, where you'll have essentially a fish buyer who has a lot of control and power in a particular system, and they're the ones who actually often provide the equipment and the finances to local fishers. Fishers are then kind of beholden to those local buyers. That reduces the agency potentially of the fishers in that system. That's not what happens everywhere. We don't want to overgeneralize, but that's often what we see in some of these systems. And so our concern here was kind of similar, is that these market intermediaries had more agency to maintain the system where it potentially is than the farmers do in potentially changing their practices for the betterment of the environment. A final point, and you can look at the paper, there's multiple points that we have and some diagrams that I didn't want to try to unpack with you all today. There's also the issue of kind of water costs are quite low, and so there's not an incentive to conserve water. That relates to the intervention that Freddie's going to talk about, the sustainable rice production SRP system, which is also designed to kind of ultimately reduce the use of water. But to me, the problem of water overuse relates again to this larger idea that when you optimize a system for one thing, that will come at the cost of lots of other things. And this is kind of an additional cost that we're seeing, is water overuse, which is not, it's not prevented by correctly pricing water for the farmers. So we drew a diagram in the paper to kind of describe what we saw in terms of the value chain for rice in the study area. And what you can see here, let me use this thing. So we have the rice farmers here, and they are really our focal point for thinking about change in the system. If you look at the local agrochemical companies, they have 3 different relationships with the farmers. They are, let's start with finance. The great majority of the 200 some farmers that we interviewed indicated that most of their financing does come from the local agrochemical companies. And the average interest rate that they got from the companies was like 24%. So Freddie often refers to this as farming on your credit card. So most of them are getting their funding from the local agrochemical companies. They're also getting technical assistance from the same actors, right? And so we also want to think about this qualitatively, how many, but also qualitatively, what type of assistance are they getting, right? These agrochemical companies are selling chemicals to the farmers, right? And so their technical assistance is oriented around the use of the chemicals that they're selling. Many of which are not as environmentally beneficent as we would like. Freddie, you were going to talk a little bit about this brokering. Oh, sorry. Selling inputs. We made these colors a little too close. They also sell the inputs, which I just mentioned. So there's multiple connections that the agrochemical companies have with the farmers that potentially give them a fair amount of control over what the farmers do. One final point, and then I'll actually go to you, Freddie, with the brokering. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is to what extent this relationship actually constitutes what we call a patron-client relationship, which is really what I was talking about in the fishing sector, right? If you have a patron-client relationship, you have one actor who has more resources that then essentially loans out or gives financial assistance or some type of assistance to another less powerful actor. That other actor is then beholden to the more powerful actor and gives that other actor less agency for change in the system. So the market intermediaries here are the more powerful patrons in this system. So we've seen this in fishing sectors across the world. I also think that there's something about this that feels like it's a similar kind of relationship here. So that was some sense making that I did here. And so Freddie's going to conclude this by talking a bit about the brokering role that they play.
Right, exactly. So once again, if you're a rice farmer in the Dominican Republic in the Northwest, for sure, that you're going to have opportunities to receive funding from cooperative, like savings and loan cooperatives, formal banks, very little from those 2 sectors. Most of it comes from chemical dealers who are selling you the inputs. So there are 2 profit centers that those guys are managing. And then you have a broker, which acts as an intermediary between the rice mills and the farmer, but not really, because he's probably more negotiating with the local ag chemical dealers. So and now we're seeing that there are a lot of rice mills going up and making arrangements with the local ag companies to facilitate financing. So it's a mess if you're a farmer.
So the last slide that I'm going to lead for a bit before we turn to Freddie's discussion of the intervention that he's been developing for some time. One of our questions was simply to ask the farmers, what are the main challenges they face? And this was fairly open-ended. They identified a lot of different challenges. You'll notice that So, this is more severe. So the longer the bars to the right, the more severe the farmers indicated the problem being on average, with some variation indicated by these bars here. Interestingly, the three most severe problems are all kind of biophysical, and the two most are about drought and just general water overuse and excessive water demand independent of drought. Then we have pests, and then what's interesting is that the next out of the top five, the two social issues are interest rates and agrochemical prices, which strongly relates to our discussion of the relationship between the farmers and the agrochemical companies. So for us, this enforced the importance of water management, and also to some extent reinforced the challenges that the farmers face vis-a-vis their relationship with the agrochemical companies.
All right, very good. So we took this information, and how are we trying to deal with it, specifically with specific actions? Well, we have a project. It's a pilot project with the rice farmers. There are 152 farmers in the project right now. They each have an average of 3.4 hectares. And excuse me, one of the most important things is that they're all farmers that are beneficiaries of the agrarian reform. So that they're former landless farmers who are now put in an ag development project with the government. And so that they have, now most of them either have provisional title or full title, which is important, because if you have full title, which is what, 23% of the farmers, they can actually use their farms for loans, for collateral. For 73, they can, but they have to get permission from the Agrarian Reform Institute before they can do it. And so there's a lot of politics going in there. So it's real important that we understand that these farmers don't have all the capacity that a market or a market-driven system can afford them in terms of inputs and things like that. Okay, next. Oh, sure. Yeah.
So Freddie and I have talked a lot about this difference between definitive and provisional title. And I think the relationship between these types of title or this is basically about property rights and farmer agency and overall outcomes is actually pretty complicated. I think from some dominant points of view, there's this idea that the more rights you have, the more agency empowered, the more agency you have and the more empowered that you are. Right. So that one of the main differences with this is that if you have definitive title, you can use your land then as collateral and get a loan. Right. So certainly that's an empowering thing. If I can't do that, right, a lot of farmers want that. One of the concerns that we have, though, with this, and this is not just in the system, is that in many cases, this actually can lead to the entrenchment of the gilded trap we were talking about, because they're using the loans as collateral to borrow money to then further industrialize their rice production systems and become more input intensive. So I'm not saying it's bad either. I'm saying that it's complicated. We want to think about the impacts of stronger property rights. Sorry, can you tell that I just wrote a book about property rights? But this is both important from some points of view, but it's also complicated from a kind of a larger social ecological perspective.
And what the reality is that a lot of lenders use that title, that leverage over farmers to consolidate rice, and they're starting to produce their own rice because they're just pushing farmers off the land. So, okay, so when this is really easy stuff. There's a bunch of practices that are aimed at reducing farmers' reliance on purchased inputs. It's scouting, and it's the usual suspects here. And also working directly with farmers in their fields on a weekly basis to help them understand what it is that the pests involved and how to treat it in a way that's more environmentally sound and economically profitable. And so this is a lot of pushback we're getting from the chemical companies, of course, because they see it as a profit center and they don't want the farmers to understand that you can reduce production costs. So, I mean, but anyway, I'm not going to go through this, but it's a lower cost of production. When you lower fertilizer and pesticide use, you reduce the contamination and the waters. One thing we have to understand about this is that we're in the Northwest Dominican Republic is a semi-arid, dry tropical forest, something like that. So it's an irrigation project, and it relies on water. And so if you don't have enough water, you have trouble. So it doesn't rain a whole lot. So by reducing their practices that rice farmers cultivating nitrogen fertilizer, how you handle stover at the end of the season, they can help reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. That's real important because rice is a huge producer of greenhouse gases in agriculture. More efficient use of irrigation, because we can show farmers that you can reduce the amount of applications and reduce the amount of water per application. But as Michael alluded to, the cost of water is so cheap that it's hard to institutionalize that within the farmer group. But we show that using less water, there's more tillering, stronger plants, less lodging, and more, and grains are healthier and longer and stronger. So farmers are seeing a benefit, but it's hard to move that system towards more sustainable practices. So this is leading to higher yields, superior grain quality, and also higher economic yield. So the set of practices in themselves is what is driving farmers' interest in adoption. And so with that, we said, okay, how do we begin to institutionalize these practices? And that's where we turn to the Sustainable Rice Platform. And the Sustainable Rice Platform is headquartered in Thailand. It's a global certification scheme that is, all kinds of actors are in that, from the big players like the UN, rice companies, lots of farmer groups, trade organizations. So it's an emerging certification that's gaining popularity, mostly in Asia, some in Africa, and we're trying to bring that to Latin America. So the SRP basically, let me go through their so just to give them service here, they have all these farm management, pre-planting practices, water use, nutrient management, pest management, harvest, post-harvest health and safety, and labor rights. So it's kind of like a fair trade kind of deal, wouldn't you say? Yeah, it's looking at not only at the agronomic stuff, but also at social justice issues and worker and farm family safety. So one of their points that we're a member, by the way. AgroFrontera is a member of the SRP, and so we should say we instead of they. So what we're pushing is that these are all kind of equally weighted in a sense. So we're trying to get a holistic approach to trying to promote sustainable rice. So that's the basics of the standard.
And this is a good time for me to talk about governance here with this.
Yeah,
Ready?
right.
And so one of the main mantras in my field is that there are no kind of purely technical solutions. And so I'm kind of professionally obligated to talk a bit about the governance challenges that are also involved in this, because this doesn't just happen, right? And one of the main challenges that you always have in any kind of environmental governance arrangement is monitoring enforcement. It's nice to have rules. It's nice to have something written down. It's nice to have a very clear formal protocol, but actually, how are you going to make sure that these rules are complied with and that the outcomes are actually achieved? And with certification, right, one of the problems you always have is who's going to watch the watcher? That's actually the problem with monitoring in general, right? We have to think about the incentives that the certifiers also have to make sure that the certification is done correctly. Something else that's actually interestingly specific to this case is that the certification is a collective certification. So Freddie is working with a group of farmers that would all be collectively certified together. That creates a basically social interdependence among those farmers that's really interesting and important to recognize from a governance perspective. Being certified, right? So if we're all farmers in this room, right, the certification is effectively a public good that we all share, right? And the public good ultimately is a market premium we would get for being a part of a certification scheme. So we all benefit from being members of this group. But if we perceive the certification to be costly individually, it's conceivable that each one of us individually would have an incentive to free ride on the efforts of others to comply with the certification. So in my field, we call that a collective action problem, where if there's a public good amongst a group, how do you make sure that people are incentivized to provide that public good, in this case, comply with the certification, and not free ride on the efforts of others, hoping that they can kind of get away with it. So there's both an issue of the incentives of the certifiers and what they're doing, how they're doing the auditing. And then there's an issue of the farmers' own incentives and their social relationships that we need to think about moving forward to make sure that this goes well.
And with that in mind, with all this, let's synthesize this in this wonderful slide. This is what we sort of want. So this leads us to what? Okay, so wow. Okay, let's step back here. Okay, so this is where we are right now in terms of trying to move these systems towards sustainability and address the issues that we've been facing since the beginning of this project about 7 or 8 years ago. So we have decided that the production part of this will be AgroFrontera at the end of the day. Hello? I don't need to say all of it. No, just keep going. All right, so okay, at the end of the day, AgroFrontera is a growers organization. So we have the agency, as you would say, to collect farmers input, and we have farmer members who are going to be certified. So AgroFrontera is the certifiable body of the SRP when we get to the point of certification. We feel that we form an LLC because we're a nonprofit. So that will be the other big change that's coming in this area. But with that, we're going to begin to work with hundreds of farmers under a certification scheme. And in addition to that, we'll be providing inputs and services and financing to farmers to try to eliminate the influence of the intermediaries. So we just put the Banco Agrícola, which is the Agrarian Bank of the Dominican Republic, as a placeholder. We think we may get money there, but we could also get it from different private-public partnership sources and things like that. Perhaps the most important partner in this kind of reinvention of a value chain is Arroz La Garza, which is a company, Foncamunis is a company. They occupy 34 to 35% of the rice market in the Dominican Republic. They've been doing it since the mid-30s. Real important stakeholder because they're the provider. So you're talking about global development. There's the pull through the system that's always needed when you're trying to change how farmers work and how their communities work. So La Garza has markets. Domestically, Bravo Supermarket is an important market in the DR, but they're also exporting to the Eastern Caribbean, starting there as well. And they're very, very interested in the certification because the certification will give them differentiation. So we're taking the information that we've developed and trying to operationalize it through the certification. Now, Arroz La Garza needs the FSSC, what is it? I forget what that stands for. It's the Food Safety System certification. And they need that, so the rice will be segregated. So I mean, this is the level of detail that we're working at. And then AgroFrontera will benefit from the SRP. So yeah, so this is really the essence of what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring in agronomic, economic, and social development through a market-driven approach to development and conservation of natural resources. Yeah. Oh, sorry, this is me again, isn't it? So what we're doing, we're taking a systems approach. And by a systems approach, I mean, look, we have this part. AgroFrontera is a small NGO. We have a partnership with Dartmouth. We have also a partnership with Counterpart International. And now we have a partnership with the Local Works program at USAID. And what that is allowing us to do is to see, because we're mostly agronomists. So if we bring in social scientists and thinking around collective action and how to engage communities in a systematic way that allows all voices. So that's what the strength of the Local Works partnership is, helping us understand how to facilitate that sort of development angle in what we're doing.
So, yeah. So moving forward, Freddie talked a little bit about kind of where we want to head with the certification. And in terms of research that I think we want to conduct to help continue to support what Freddie's doing, but also to continue to accumulate theoretically and applied knowledge for this case. One of the things that we haven't mentioned, which is very relevant for the system, is DR-CAFTA. Initially, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, then the Dominican Republic I added, so it's called DR-CAFTA, is actively being unfolded within the DR, and it's a real potential threat to the Dominican rice sector. So over time, import quotas are going up, tariffs on rice imports are going down, and that has the potential for, say, U.S. rice to outcompete Dominican rice, which, if you remember from the Gilded Trap discussion, right, the farmers that we're talking to don't have necessarily a lot of diversity in terms of the crops they're growing or their sources of livelihood, right? So they don't necessarily have like a backup plan in terms of livelihood if suddenly they're being outcompeted by imported rice. So one of the things we want to study moving forward with some current students at Dartmouth is how are farmers responding to what is essentially a political disturbance in the form of this international policy? Do they have plans? How are they thinking about that? Are they thinking about livelihood diversity or not? One other thing that I'm really excited about, and we're actually working together on right now, is a series of essentially game-based exercises with the farmers. This is another topic I could nerd out real quick about, but essentially the idea is game-based experiments have been used for a long time in behavioral economics and social psychology to understand the influence of certain factors on behavior. And so there are a lot of these experiments focus on the use of common resources or public goods, referring to that framing I mentioned earlier. There's a new movement to use these types of game-based experiments in the field as vitamins, as a colleague of mine, Juan Camilo Cardenas, likes to say, so as a treatment in themselves. So instead of, or in addition to, using a game-based experiment to try to understand the behavior of resource users, try to have a game-based experiment where, in this case, farmers would have roles as along a kind of make-believe irrigation system, and you're kind of doing a role-playing experiment with them where they have to decide how much water they're using over time. Can that itself be used as a participatory governance mechanism? And it's actually been interesting when we've been kind of piloting this. Freddie's been telling me that the kind of discussions that the farmers have been having after they participate in this game have been really interesting, because it kind of opens up space for them to talk about their issues, maybe their dissatisfactions with La Junta, which is the kind of formal irrigation governance system that they have there. So that's something that I'm really excited for us to move forward as well.
Yeah, I think that's about all.
I think that's about all the time we have, yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. David, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I guess I'm just going to go back to the picture that you just showed. That looks like an awful lot bigger than 3.5 hectares. So I guess my question is the land collectively farmed? And if it is, that raises a whole set of issues regarding management of labor inputs, management of off-farm inputs, et cetera, et cetera. And if it isn't, maybe you could just explain what we're looking at here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we're probably looking at 3 or 4 farmers farming that area. I mean, the whole shebang is flat. So so farmers have an average of about 3.5 hectares, like I was saying, but they're neighbors. And so because water, a lot of this is depending on water management in rice, of course, because and that's part of the issue, is that one of the challenges is that one farmer will use, a head-end user will use water that's right out of the canal. By the time that gets to the end of the system, that's water is being recycled 2 or 3 times. So, well, you know, the agrarian reform structured it so that they would work collectively to address issues of inputs and markets and things like that. That's how the Agrarian Reform Institute was trying to push it. So yeah, that also just emphasizes the need for collective action with farmers in an area, because farmers do share a resource.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentation. I love the way you integrated all these different dimensions of governance and all that goes into a social, transformational change process. My main question is about the capacity building that's needed and the further understanding of these concepts, but also the skills that farmers and other participants in this value chain might need in order to help, accelerate the kind of change process that I think you all are stimulating. And in particular, one place in particular where I'm curious is the process of moving from, let's call it the the input intensive approach to the more sustainable approach. Does that come fairly easily and naturally to farmers, or is that a bottleneck that you have to work at to get, them to really understand the difference and change their practices?
Right, very good. There are a couple of answers to that. The first answer would be that the model that we're trying to promote, where all the farmers are members of AgroFrontera and they receive technical assistance, we're trying to produce clusters of learning clusters within that, so that there's facilitation of neighbor to neighbor, farmer to farmer exchange. What was the second part of the question?
It's mainly about, so you mainly
Okay.
is through this, what I would kind of call a social learning approach, where you get farmers teaching one another.
Right.
And so on.
Right.
And how difficult is it? In other words, is it relatively gradual and difficult, transformation is a real shift in mindset and practice?
Okay, so the benefit of this is that the actual practices reduce costs and improve grain. I mean, all the kind of agronomic bells that a farmer is listening for. And so when he or she understands that, their neighbor understands it, there becomes, it just kind of allows that chain to develop. And that's what we're pushing. In fact, we've been, we're getting more calls for technical assistance than we can provide. So we're optimistic that that's going to work in the long run. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about the data that's collected for certification, and how that's used by farmers. Well, first of all, how do you collect and manage all of that data for certification?
Mhm.
And then the second question is, how does that interact with what I do as a farmer on my plot, and how does that help me improve my management? Because mostly the data is for the purposes of the Bravo supermarket and for the sustainable rice. It's not, normally as a farmer, I don't take data. I just
Right.
grow rice.
So you're right. I mean, one of the strengths of the SRP, the Sustainable Rice Platform, is that they kind of menu drive that. In other words, they tell you what data needs to be collected at the farm level, at the collective level, and they try to do that in a way that, now, there's a lot of technical assistance, and that's what we don't really know. I mean, Charles, the truth is that it's being subsidized right now because we're technicians working with farmers. We're helping them collect their data, and we're archiving it, right? So that remains to be seen if the certification, now the certifications, the entity that's going to do it is Global Gap now, which is different than in the past. And that's a different business model, right? Yeah. So we're trying to make sure that works, right? But I'll tell you, the rice company is really interested in making it work. And that's important. The farmers understand because, there's a lot of fair trade bananas in the region as well. So there's an understanding that there's going to be kind of record keeping that's involved in this. And no farmer wants to fall out of the system because it is a group certification, like Mike was saying. And that's why I think that's why I think AgroFrontera is really important in this, because AgroFrontera has, we can get donations, but we also need to make sure that this system is economically viable.
Just to follow up, in the banana business, it's their group marketed. And it's the associations who really keep the record. The farmers have to pay attention, and they may write it down, but it's really kept in the official form.
Well, obviously, we're keeping, right. We're making sure that there's integrity in the data that's being collected. So, they say the certification is divided, but really we're in charge. And the banana sector it's different because, first of all, it's dollar-based. It's much more economically driven because the markets are export markets that the fair trade market is. And so we're kind of concerned about that as well, because rice is a commodity, and it's going to be interesting to see if there's enough what is it called? Yeah, diversification in the product itself that will allow a price premium that will flow back through the system. So, I mean, this is really interesting that we're doing global development, because this is what it's all about. You have to be able to economically, socially, and agronomically, and even environmentally justify intervention.
I just wanted to add something to the discussion you both had about like the incentives that farmers have to change their behavior. And Freddie's response and that discussion actually reflected, to me, a very strong finding from the social science on behavior change that I know, which across many different studies and papers emphasizes the importance of social influence. That I will change my behavior if a member of my group, particularly if they're prestigious and if I trust them, changes their behavior. So if people have models that they trust, that they can say, oh, well, if there's a proof of concept here from someone that I trust, then I'm more likely to change my behavior. That's been shown across a variety of applied contexts as often the most important predictor of whether or not someone actually changes their own behavior. And I think sometimes that can be underemphasized, because the implications of that for someone like Freddie is that it takes time to build up that trust, right? It takes time to build up yourself as a locally prestigious, trustworthy organization that can be used as a model for changing these behaviors. And so if you're thinking about a project in terms of a 2 or 3 year horizon, right, that's often not enough time to leverage the importance of social influence to get a few farmers that start to adopt these practices that can then be seen as models for other farmers. But I just want to reinforce that, again, like, to me, it's important when I hear this discussion that that's backed up by a lot of social science research on what impacts behavioral change towards conservation.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sorry I didn't get to every question, but the speakers, I think, will be around for 5 or 10 minutes afterwards if you want to raise your question individually. So thanks so much. Join me in thanking